Good morning, or good afternoon, I should say, and welcome to the Daily Journal's Capitol View webcast. I'm Chris Kiefer, managing editor for multimedia here at the Daily Journal, and as always, we're going to talk about state politics with Daily Journal Capitol Bureau Chief Bobby Harrison. Bobby, what's going on down there in Jackson today?
Hey, just a bright, sunny day here in Jackson, Chris. Everything's good.
Good. You need to send us some of that warm weather. It's been cold here for April.
Yeah, it's a little chilly here too, but it's warmed up nicely.
Sure. Well, I know you're probably enjoying it a little bit more quiet time now that the legislative session is over. However, you wrote about today that maybe there could be a special session in the wings. We've talked, Bobby, throughout this program about transportation as one of the big themes of the 2018 session, and one of the biggest issues that didn't get solved in 2018 and for the last several years. That's kind of been a trend. Legislators come into the session trying to find more money for roads and bridges and haven't been able to find a way. You wrote today, though, that there could be a solution before they meet again in 2019. What's the latest on that?
Could be an attempt at a solution.
Yeah,
might be more accurate. I just checked with the governor's office yesterday because there was just sort of chatter in the building that there was going to be a special session before the end of the week, and so on some things regarding transportation. So since I was scheduled to be off this Friday, I just decided I needed to find out, and the governor's office did confirm that talks are continuing on trying to find a resolution to the issue, and if a resolution could be found, he would probably call a special session, but that's not imminent by any means. But there is there is an ongoing effort to try to come to a solution on where to get more money for transportation needs, but they're not there yet.
So to kind of remind people, put the issue in perspective, of course, this is about roads and bridges as they're aging. There seems to be, as you've written many times, a consensus. Most people agree that, the state needs more money for roads and bridges. Right now, the funding comes from the 1987 transportation bill that puts a gas tax at 18.4 cents per gallon.
That's right.
That money has stayed flat. Costs have gone up. They need more money. The problem, as you've written many times, is where does that money come from? Particularly with the aversion to raising taxes, and if you don't raise taxes, I know you've written the studies say maybe $400 million a year is what's needed. So, taking all that, these talks, what are some of their options?
Well, nobody's kind of articulated it, Chris, in a really concise manner, but there seems to be constant talk of tying money from a settlement with BP Oil to some type of transportation needs, and that would not be a regular source of money, but it would be, a continuous source of money, but it'd be a source of money for a number of years. And of course, this is money that the state received for damages related to the oil spill, the big explosion, I think 2010, Horizon oil, what do you call it, the oil drilling rig or whatever, that caused a massive oil spill on the Gulf Coast, and the state is, I think, supposed to get, around $750 million from that oil spill, and there's been a disagreement on where that money should go. The coast legislators think the money should be directed to the coast, since that's where the oil spill occurred and where the damages happened. But others point out that the money was supposed to be for lost sales tax revenue that the state gets, and of course, the sales tax revenue goes statewide, and only 18.5% of that of the sales tax collected in any particular city stays in that city. So under that theory, the coast should only get 18.5% of the money. So, but there's just an ongoing disagreement about how that money should be dispersed. But there seems to be at least some movement that that money would be part of any some type of resolution to the transportation issue. Right now, there's about $100 million of the money in reserves, and the state's probably going to get another I'm not sure, another $500 million over multiple years. And, so that may be part of the solution. It may not be part of the solution. I'm just kind of reading between the lines, reading the tea leaves when I say that. Other thing, some people talked about enacting a lottery without money going to transportation. The logical thing is to increase the cigarette, not the cigarette tax. That would be another source of money, but to increase the gasoline tax. But there is absolutely no will to do that by the legislative leadership. So, if you don't do any of those things, the only option is to take money from the reserves or to take money from other programs and divert it to transportation. And that proves difficult to do. And, because of the, current situation where, tax revenues are tight and most agencies already have suffered, cuts of double digits or more over the past three sessions. So there's a when you divert money from other agencies to transportation, that has real consequences on those other agencies.
What about at one point in this process, there's been some talk about taking the internet tax, the use tax, and putting some of that towards transportation. Do you think that is still on the table, or is that pretty much a dead issue now?
Well, there's some talk about that, Chris, but I think, you get different numbers, but the best I can ascertain from numbers, you get from the Department of Revenue, while there's a disagreement about whether these internet companies are required to collect this sales tax or use tax as it is, the Supreme Court is, based on a 1990s ruling, said that the internet companies don't have to collect the tax. There seems to be the case that most of the companies, are collecting the tax already from Mississippi. So if there is so you're taking money that's already going to these other agencies. When you take that money and, you're still talking about diverting money from other agencies to transportation, because like I said, the consensus is that most internet companies are collecting the tax and it's already being spent on education, public health, law enforcement. So if you take that money and divert it, it would affect those agencies.
Yeah, going back during the session, both chambers passed their own plans, and a lot of them were, piecing together, either taking funds that went elsewhere, taking funds from the, the extra % or 2% of revenue that legislators don't spend, or bond bills, or et cetera. As they work together now, as leaders work together now on a possible solution, do you foresee it kind of containing elements of Tate Reeves' bridge plan or Philip Gunn's plan that he passed, or do you think that it'll be significantly different from those plans, or are those plans more or less dead?
No, I think that whatever they do is going to, in the end, result in taking money from other programs, which is what we've been talking about, and essentially is what the bridge program and the Philip Gunn programs did is diverted money from other agencies to transportation. I think that would be done in some manner. And it was interesting. I don't know if I reported this quote, but I remember I talked to the speaker after the session. He said that he would be willing to take money out of reserves to sort of offset that transfer. So he said, I didn't, that just didn't come up in the legislative session because we didn't get that far. So I think that you're going to see a scenario where if there is a resolution, it is going to entail taking existing funds that right now go to some of those other agencies and diverting those funds to transportation, because there's just no will to raise the cigarette tax. I'll keep on going back to the cigarette tax. There's no will to raise the gasoline tax, and there's no will to raise any taxes to pay for transportation. The lottery for a lot of people seems like a logical place to turn. It wouldn't generate as much money as some people say transportation needs, but it would be, a consistent source of revenue and a steady revenue stream and a sizable revenue stream. And so we'll see, that's the only other option out there that I see has a chance of going somewhere. As related to a continuous source of revenue.
Sure. how close? I mean, you started this off by saying you were hearing that a session could be called as early as Friday, and it sounds like that's not likely. But
No, that's not going to happen.
Okay, do you think it'll be near future though? Is it hard to say? Do you think this could be? Do you think
it's hard to say? It's
yeah,
really
when it might happen. Yeah, sure. Moving on a second, but I guess segue before we do. I know you and I will be talking a little bit more off air after this for the podcast, for the memo podcast that we do. The theme of this week's episode is the transportation debate and kind of this whole debate about people say they need more funds for roads and bridges, but can't figure out where the source should be. So anyway, for anyone who's interested in hearing more about that topic, look for this week's memo podcast. That should be out on Thursday. Memo.journal.com. It's also in iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Google Play. So we will have a lot more for you there. Transitioning here, Bobby, talking about the state budget now, and you wrote, I guess last week, as the session had come to a close, for a couple of years, you were looking at state budgets that were cut and less than the year before. That stabilized somewhat this year, correct?
That's right. There was a small increase. I want to say, you may have the numbers in front of you. I want to say not a big increase. I think around $22 million, which is a $6 billion budget is not much, but it reversed a trend of the past couple of years where state budget has been cut by, I want to say, between $300 and $400 million.
Yeah, it was $360 million during the past 2 years, and then the increase this year is $22.4 million, which is 0.04% higher than the year before. Yeah,
which is essentially a flat budget. But after the past 2 years, that was welcomed by a lot of agencies, that had suffered some pretty substantial cuts.
And I guess like anything in politics, there's different perspectives on how you read that budget. Tate Reeves, the lieutenant governor, had a quote in your story about prioritizing core functions of government and providing extra funds for things like public safety and so forth. And meanwhile, Democratic Senator Hot Bryan from Amory, said there's concern that while the economy is growing, the budget is staying relatively stable. Is that kind of the two different perspectives?
Yeah, that's kind of that's what's kind of missed in all this budget cuts over the past couple of years. They've come at a time where the economy has been pretty good, and at least nationally, and yet our revenue has been sluggish. Most people attribute that to the fact that there's been some pretty massive tax cuts that's only going to grow in their size over the next several years. I think that this coming budget year, there's going to be an extra $50, $60 million taken out of this revenue stream because of tax cuts. So any growth to that just sort of natural growth in in revenue, which occurs most years, is kind of being offset by these tax cuts. And so that's kind of the at least that appears to be what's happening, because the economy is sort of humming along at a fairly decent pace, yet the state revenue is not growing to coincide with that improved economy.
But Bobby, you had in your story just kind of looking at the comparison year over year of a few different agencies, and people can find that at djournal.com or in the Daily Journal. For instance, kindergarten through 12th grade public education is $2.4 billion, which is up $4.6 million, and so forth. One that stood out to me was the Mississippi Development Authority is a significant decrease for the amount. $21.4 million is the budget, which is down $8.7 million. So that would mean that's a pretty hefty percentage. Did that stand out to you, or anything that stood out to you about the numbers?
Yeah, and I got to say there wasn't much talk about that. At the time, there's been a general consensus through the years that the state, has sort of a tourism industry that has been growing through the years, but it's still kind of untapped. And there's been a desire to put more money into tourism, into more money into MDA for tourism efforts, but that didn't happen this year. But there wasn't much talk about it during the session. Hadn't heard many people complain about it. Of course, MDA is executive director is Glenn McCullough, former mayor of Tupelo, and he's a Phil Bryant. He's a appointee of the governor and is a good team player. So even if he felt that MDA needed more money, he would be he probably wouldn't be too willing to talk about it at the same time, because I said, he's through the years has been a good team player and has gotten a lot of credit for doing a lot for that agency. So maybe that's the reason we hadn't heard much about the cut at MDA.
Sure, interesting. Staying on the topic of revenue, you had a story this weekend. Revenue collections had been going well for the current year until it got to March, and March had a pretty significant dip. And I can pull up the numbers in a second, but it was big enough that it turned it from for the year being above the estimate to being below the estimate. And as you've written, now that the state is below the revenue estimate, that's significant because that's the amount of money that legislators use to set the budget. Tell us about that.
Well, I mean, right now, there's I think everything's okay, but if you had another, and we're in the last quarter of the budget year, if you will. So if you had some more, if you had an April or May that was on the same level as March, it might create some hardships, but for the budget. But and then it would probably force Governor Bryant to sort of dip into the reserve funds to offset to make up the loss of revenue. But right now, I think it's okay because when the legislature enacted the budget, they enacted the budget year we're in right now was enacted during the 2017 session, and then when they did that, they only appropriated 99% of projected revenue. So there's 1% cushion, about $56 million. So as long as the revenues don't fall below $56 million, everything's going to be okay. But it just shows, for the past 2 years, revenue collections have been sluggish. They had improved this year, but so March might have been just sort of one of those anonymous aberrations. Anonymous, I can't say that word.
Yeah, and anomalies, huh?
Yeah. But so we just have to find out if they improve again in April. And sometimes this time of year, sometimes that happens where. There's a lot of taxes going in and out this time of year. As tax, as an April 15th deadline, or I think it's April 17th this year, looms. There's a lot of money going in and out of the Treasury, so it all might sort of work itself out in the next few weeks, and revenue collections get back on a more steady course. But March did at least give legislative leaders at least a little bit of a pause and a cause for concern.
Bobby, you mentioned the tax cuts earlier, and when you look comparison in individual categories, I guess for overall for the year, revenue collections are now down $12.3 million, which is just 0.33%. But when you break it down individually, sales tax is up by $12 million. Individual income tax is slightly down by $1.5 million. Use tax is up. The biggest one is corporate taxes down $41.2 million. And that seems to be, I guess, kind of what's led to the decline in a lot of ways. I mean, is there a lot of discussion on that? Corporate taxes is kind of where a lot of this is coming from?
Yeah, that's where a lot of it's coming from. And that's where a lot of the tax cuts have occurred, Chris, over the past 5 to 6 years. And that's where the big tax cut that was passed during the 2016 session, there was a big corporate tax cuts, and that's being phased in. So you can see that corporate tax collections continue to decline over the next several years. And the use tax collections is the interesting one, Chris, because I think that shows that the increase there shows that the internet companies are collecting and remitting that use tax to the state, that 7% tax, just like the local retailers do. You heard the president complaining that Amazon doesn't collect taxes. Well, actually, Amazon is collecting taxes now, and that's a big reason that the use tax is growing in Mississippi. Just in the income tax, that's the one to keep an eye on in April. Because that's a big month for income taxes. So we'll see what happens to see if that improves or continues to be sluggish. So that could be the telltale sign of what the final numbers are going to look like in terms of revenue collections, and whether the governor has to dip into the rainy day fund to offset any revenue shortfalls.
Sure. So April will be a big month for that, and as you wrote in your story, if the revenue comes up short, it's kind of too late in the year to do any budget cuts, because that money's been spent. So I guess it would go to the reserve fund. I think you read there's about $310 million in that fund right now. All right. Well, that does it for another episode of Capitol View. Thank you for watching again, and remind you can watch us each week to talk about state politics. We try to do it Mondays at 2, but schedules change sometimes, and you can catch our updates on the Daily Journal's Twitter page at TJournal Now on Twitter. And as always, Bobby, thanks for joining us, and we will see you next week.
All right.